Hello, hello, true crime fans. Welcome back to For Criming Out Loud and our Crime Me to Sleep bedtime series. This is episode 7 of Buried Beneath the Boarding House. So if you're new here, make sure you subscribe and go into the playlist to start the book from the beginning. Let's get into episode 7 of Buried Beneath the Boarding House. Marriages and Empty Rooms. Roberto Puente was a Mexican immigrant, aged only 20 years old, when he fell for Dorothea. In her, he saw a future for himself in the United States, a life where he did not have to hide from the immigration authorities, and where he didn't have to work all hours of the day for a pittance just to put food on the table. Dorothea had money. That much was obvious from the fancy clothes she wore and the airs and graces that she affected. More importantly, he had seen her looking at him and understood exactly what those burning stares meant. When someone was letting their heart rule them, they could ignore any of the silly little worries that the head provided. She wouldn't even question why a young man, young enough to be her son, wanted to take her to bed or down the aisle. Their relationship soon developed beyond business, and all of the other illegal workers were let go. He would be the full-time handyman for the boarding house, and she would provide for him in whatever way he desired. They made an odd couple, with her hair already starting to turn white, and his head already turning wherever a girl went by. The boarding house opened up in late 1966, and almost immediately, all 24 rooms were filled up. The state had an overwhelming number of disabled and homeless people in its care, and the social workers who saw Dorothea providing her residents with clean clothes and home-cooked meals every day considered her to be something like a saint. They didn't give a damn that her boarding house was unlicensed when she did so much for the community. The actual extent of her hospitality was fairly minimal compared to any real establishment, but it was so far beyond what the homeless and chronically ill residents were accustomed to that they sang her praises at every opportunity. And if the odd check went missing in the mail, then that was just a part of life with an ever-fluctuating address. In 1968, Dorothea and Roberto traveled to Mexico City, where they had an extravagant wedding, the third largest in Dorothea's life. She adored it in Mexico, claiming that she was home at last, despite never having even visited before. She was quite reluctant to return to the drudgery of tending to the elderly and to the sick, or to her ongoing suspicions that Roberto's wandering eye may have become something more sinister. With his citizenship assured, Roberto's fidelity began to wane. He endured Dorothea's lustful honeymooning for as long as he could stomach before moving into one of the spare rooms in the boarding house, complaining of her snoring. He was never quite stupid enough to bring another woman back there, knowing that the residents were thoroughly in Dorothea's thrall and ready to report on his activities at the drop of a hat. But it was still the first step away from conjugal life and into something more exciting. As she was a pillar of the community, respected by all, stories filtered back to Dorothea about sightings of Roberto in the company of other women. He was openly courting several girls his own age when he first met Dorothea years before, and that had never stopped, but just became more subtle. He was lying to all of them, insisting to each of his women that the others either didn't exist or that they meant nothing to him. He was a wannabe Lothario of the worst sort, and it was only luck in his growing disgust at his plump elderly wife that protected her from any number of STDs. Still, Dorothea found herself untroubled by what her young husband did behind closed doors, so long as he presented a good face for the Hispanic community and the many opportunities that Dorothea was finding there. Sacramento was a city in the grip of innumerable social gripes in the late 60s, from homelessness and drug abuse to the new and pressing concern of the deinstitutionalization of the majority of the mentally ill people in the country, from the now reviled state hospitals that had once kept them contained. While this massive political movement had allowed patients to escape atrocious conditions, it had also left them without any means of accessing treatment, abandoned in a world that had long left them behind. The end result of which was a state of crimes that followed no logical course, and a massive growth in the homeless population that almost approached the population movements of the Dust Bowl. All of these crises called out for cash. Money was the only solution to the nation's sweeping social ills. No matter how much anyone volunteered, as Dorothea did, it was generally accepted that major change could not be made without political lobbying, massive charitable programs, and reformation of the state hospital system. Dorothea had always reveled in being the center of attention, spending every penny that she had acquired on fancy clothes, makeup, perfume, and similar fripperies. But now that her beauty was in decline, she found some other way to invest her cash that gave her just as much, if not more, attention. She became a massive donor to many charities, attended many $50 a plate banquets, and established herself in the upper classes of Sacramento society as the de facto spokesperson for huge swaths of the Hispanic community through her contributions to many important political war chests. The glamorous life that she had always invented for herself, full of suave politicians, beautiful starlets, and music, was suddenly her reality. She ate dinner with Pat Brown, Ronald Reagan, and his first wife, Jane Wyman. Through her connections with Reagan, she began attending more evening events with senators and even, on one memorable occasion, major Republican contributor Clint Eastwood, although she was disappointed to find out that he was more interested in his date than her. All of the money that she was throwing around demanded that she steal more and more from her residents, but the unexpected result of all her schmoozing that she now had an unexpected air of legitimacy about her. The suspicion that might have once latched onto her as her clients' checks and personal belongings went missing now slipped right off of her. She needed only have one brief conversation with the police following the first bout of accusations against her about the kind of clients that she provided housing to, their memory troubles, and the way that they often preyed on one another, sometimes unintentionally. On the walls behind her in the little private room that she had set aside for herself in the boarding house were a massive collage of framed photographs, each one of them of her or her husband shaking hands with a celebrity, politician, or other local person of influence. The message was clear. This was a well-connected woman who could be trusted a little bit more than some mentally ill homeless people who had thought they had lost a diamond ring sometime in the past year. Still, the complaints continued to flow in every direction, both from current residents and past ones. Claims that Dorothea was pocketing social security checks and only paying out spending money to her residents fell on deaf ears in the social work community, where it was considered that anyone putting the brakes on an alcoholic's access to liquor was probably doing the right thing. Throughout all of this, Roberto had been enjoying the benefits of the marriage without doing much of the required work. He'd been spending less and less time at the boarding house as the money flowed more readily, and that became clear as the building began to fall into disrepair. Dorothea eventually had to recruit a few of the more reliable homeless residents of the neighborhood to do odd jobs for her to keep up appearances for the constant visits from social workers. While he would come along to the fancy dinners and shows that Dorothea attended, it wasn't to be in her company for any longer than was necessary to get the free food and open bar. The social aspect of their marriage, had also deteriorated beyond all repair. They argued incessantly in the small amount of time that they spent together. They'd not shared a bed since about the very first days of the marriage, and Roberto was ever more open about his disgust of Dorothea. He had checked out of his marriage in every way that mattered, long before things became more serious with one of his other girls. By the time that he officially left, it seems that Dorothea had made her peace with it. When she found his room in the boarding house empty, she treated it like any of her other flight risk tenants vanishing in the middle of the night. She boxed up everything he had left behind, pocketed anything of value, and gave the room a thorough clean. If anything, her abandonment was relief for Dorothea. She no longer had to uphold the facade of a marriage on top of the many other duties that filled her days. It also gave her the freedom to start looking for a new husband without any judgment from the community. She had been abandoned, so she firmly held the moral high ground, even if Roberta ever did come back. Dorothea hit the bars of Sacramento with a bounce in her step. The years may not have treated her kindly enough to attract a young man again, but she had a certain amount of glamour to her, thanks to her fine clothes and makeup, that reminded older gentlemen of the celebrities of a bygone age. It probably helped that Dorothea seemed to have developed a newfound interest in the older man, an interest that often manifested during her barroom conversations with them, when she inquired at great length about which benefits they were receiving from the state. She managed to fill several of her empty boarding house rooms with barflies before becoming more aggressive in pursuing what she really wanted as time went by. She slipped back into her old routine with a slightly classier twist. She would allow older gentlemen to invite her home, then rob them blind after the drugs that she had slipped into their drinks kicked in. A few of them were still conscious but unable to move during her ransacking of their homes, so it wasn't difficult for the police to pull together a description of the mystery robber, striking fear into the lonely hearts of embarrassed older men. The police began closing in on her, talking to business owners who had been handed forged checks and bartenders who had seen their best customers vanish off into the night with a mysterious, glamorous woman, only to return with horror stories the next day. Far more victims than had been reported to the police, of course. Of all of her victims' tales, one of the most harrowing has to belong to Malcolm Mackenzie. He was a 74-year-old pensioner and a regular at the Zebra Club. He had seen her around several times before they finally got together. They had several drinks together, with her gradually gathering information about him under the guise of being interested. Then, when he invited her back to his place, she insisted on getting him one more drink before they departed. On the taxi ride home, Malcolm began to feel dizzy, but he put it down to a long day and the liquor that he had just consumed, rather than anything more insidious. Yet, when they got back to his apartment, he found that he had to lean heavily on Dorothea's shoulder to make it up the stairs. Inside the apartment, she dumped him unceremoniously onto the couch, and then stalked off to dig through his belongings in search of anything valuable. Trapped in place by the drugs, he could do nothing as she stole his rare penny collection, his checkbook, and all of the cash he had hidden in the house. Finally, she came over to look at him where he lay paralyzed. Despite his terror at what she might do next, his heartbeat was languid thanks to the drugs, and all he could do was watch as she bent down and set to work on his hand. He had a diamond ring on his smallest finger that had caught her attention in the bar, and even though his fingers were swollen, she had no intention of leaving without that prize. After several minutes of tugging on the ring and popping his finger in and out of place, she went to the kitchen to fetch lard for lubrication. With his finger greased, she was able to work the ring off, and with a pleasing little bounce, she tucked it into her pocket. She leaned in closer with that done, ignoring the injury that she had done to his aching hand, and staring instead into his eyes. He was shaking with effort of trying to move, but Dorothea did not intend to do him any more damage. Instead, she reached out carefully and drew his eyes shut with her fingertips. He would not recover enough to contact the police about the robbery until the next afternoon, by which time Dorothea had already fenced the stolen coin collection through one of the local homeless men that she was cultivating. Without propriety keeping her in check, Dorothea was free to continue this way forever. But with every check she wrote or wallet she lifted, she came a little closer to being cast into jail once more. It was only luck and a little lust that saved her from this fate. In 1976, 9 years after her failed but still legally binding marriage to Roberto Puente, she met her next husband. Pedro Montalvo was an alcoholic whom Dorothea had picked up in a bar, intending to make him the latest in the long line of victims she had acquired. But she found herself so charmed by the brash character of the man that she didn't drug his drink. They talked late into the night, and by morning he had moved into her little apartment above the boarding house. Her marriage to Roberto may have been short-lived compared to her earlier relationships, but it seemed like it lasted forever in comparison with her time to Pedro. Once again, the honeymoon period was happy for both partners. They wed in a small ceremony at a local church. Dorothea never tried to file the official paperwork, knowing that her polygamy would show up in the records, and without ever having to formally acquire a divorce, she was nervous about the questions that might be posed to her in light of the latest addition to her household. She invited none of her high society friends, and even from among the Hispanic community, which she wrongly called her own, she brought only a few guests to make everything appear as normal as possible. This fresh start was already tainted by deception, but it was soon darkened even further when Pedro revealed his rather sinister temper. When Dorothea would not submit to him in all matters without question, he lashed out with his fists, and when he was drunk, which was as often as he could manage, his temper often swung wildly out of control. Dorothea had been hit before, by her abusive parents and her first husband, but she had never been on the receiving end of the kind of beatings that Pedro dealt out for no good reason at all. Dorothea withdrew from their shared apartment on F Street, spending more and more time in the company of the residents in the boarding house, and finding that she actually enjoyed their company and adoration. They were all people on the edge of desperation, and she represented a way for them to hold on to their humanity for a little bit longer. Just as she sheltered them from the outside world, their presence shielded her from Pedro's rages. What had been a parasitic relationship gradually became more symbiotic. She would never have the kind of familial emotional attachment to her boarders that they seemed to crave, but she began to see their value as something more than just a meal ticket. With his new wife disobedient and absent, his new punching bag perpetually unavailable, and his presence clearly not an affront to the residents of the boarding house, Pedro did not last long. Just 2 months after their haphazard wedding, he left Dorothea on a bender that would carry him off across state lines, never to return. If she missed him, it never showed. With her newfound attachment to the people in her care, Dorothea might have gone from acting like a good person for the praise and attention to actually caring about others, if she were capable of such a thing. Instead, she continued to treat them just as badly as she could get away with, while still garnering positive attention for her kindness. Still, Pedro did leave her with one positive legacy. She was broken of her desire to have a husband in her life. She could reach out for all of the love and support that she needed from the people in her care, and she had no desire to get chained to another maniac. From this point forward, Dorothea intended to live her life alone and well. The Mexican community in Sacramento had already been indebted to Dorothea for the contributions she made to arts and education programs for their advancement, but now she took a step forward to becoming something more like a social worker for the women. She used her knowledge of drugs and herbalism to assist them in acquiring birth control, even though the controlling men in their lives forbade it, provided them with advice, and even guided some of them through the sticky prospects of divorce proceedings when they were too frightened to stand up to their abusive partners. They called her La Doctora, but to many of the women, she was considered to be more of a mother figure, someone who had been through the worst that marriages had to offer and come out on the other side brave and unscathed. She continued to trawl bars, but her methodology changed significantly in light of her new revulsion towards men and the gathering heat around the barroom robberies. Up until now, she had been acting like her younger self, trusting in luck to keep her safe. Now, she started applying some of the criminal skills that she had picked up during her long prison stays. Rather than robbing the men in the bars, she identified which ones were in receipt of pensions or benefits from the state, and then gathered enough information to make a false change of address claim so that all of their future payments were sent to her house on F Street. With so many other checks of the same kind heading to her house and the constant flux of her clientele, she already had the perfect disguise in place in case any attention was given to these diverted payments. Between the money that she was drawing from her existing clients and the money she was securing through these acts of treasury fraud, she found that even with her massive charitable and political contributions, she wasn't spending all of her money each month. She began turning her attention to other potential sources of income. investments that would continue to pay out without her having to put in any additional effort. She was rubbing shoulders with the truly wealthy on a weekly basis, and she had seen the way that rich people became richer just by letting their money sit in some company. She wanted in, and it was this ceaseless hunt for easy money that brought Dorothea into contact with Ruth Monroe. Thank you for listening to episode 7 of Buried Beneath the Boarding House. If you're enjoying this true crime story so far, please take a minute and hit the like button, and please subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Until then, good night.